I'll call the meeting. Oh, sorry. All right. So I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is the Salt Lake City Human Rights Commission meeting on May 2nd, 2023. We're going to take a roll. Present, I am Chair Jason Wessel, representing District 1. If we can go clockwise around the table.
Thank you. David Lido, representing District 6.
Will Terry, representing District 4.
Are you doing all the commissioners first?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Michelle Mooney, Salt Lake City Mayor's Office.
We have a guest.
Very good.
There it is.
Andrew Johnson, Salt Lake City Mayor's Office. I'm just a guest.
And then Maria Romero, Executive Assistant to the Chief Equity Officer and Director of Homeless Policy and Outreach.
Olivia Jaramillo, District 3.
And then let's go online. Everett, if you introduce yourself.
Sure, Everett Bacon, representing at-large Accessibility and Disability Commission.
And Esther.
Esther Stoll, representing District 2, Poplar Grove.
Michelle, do we have anybody else online? Okay, that is everybody, and that gives us a quorum. So that I will continue on the agenda. I believe the minutes were distributed from the last meeting. If everybody has had an opportunity to look over the minutes, we'll entertain a motion to any motions involving the minutes.
I move we approve the minutes.
Second.
Okay, see that is a motion to adopt the minutes by Commissioner Lida and seconded by Commissioners Jaramillo and Bacon. We'll adopt it without objection. I'll say without objection 3 times. If there's an objection, object. If not, we'll see that it has passed. So without objection, without objection, without objection. Recognizing that there's no objection, that motion passes.
Mr. Chair, I have a question concerning the meeting last month. Hannah Reagan said that she would email the commission the city's position on the bills that were discussed during the legislature. I don't remember seeing an email with that. Has that just skipped my inbox, or did we actually get an email from
We have not received an email yet, but I will follow up on that, just because I think she had to talk to.
I was gonna ask that you do that, Michelle.
Yes.
I really would
You
like
want-
to see what the
yes.
city's position has been on these various bills that were discussed.
Let me take a look at that.
Thank you, Commissioner. We don't have any members of the public in the room or online, so we pass by item 3 on the agenda for public comments. So that gives us, for the next 60 minutes, we have Andrew Johnson, the Director of Homelessness Policy and Outreach, who's going to give us an overview on the current initiatives regarding population experiencing homelessness. I'd ask if you could please give us some time at the end, maybe for questions. I'm pretty sure there's quite a few questions from members of the commission. Thank you.
I will focus on keeping lots of time at the end of this. Pretty cool.
And Mr. Chair,
Yes, Everett?
just wanted to let you know that I just wanted to let you know that I will have to leave early, and so I'll just step away when I have to leave.
Okay, I believe that we don't have anything substantive that we need to vote on. Looking at the agenda, so you can just excuse yourself when you need to go, and it won't impact the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, Mr. Chair, I have a presentation. I'm going to share my screen, and that might be a good jumping off point for questions or comments or anything that comes to your mind as we go through this. It's a simplified version of the system, and then a few things added in for some context for things you may have heard about. So I'm going to share my screen for everyone online, hopefully. And there it is. I'm going to go to the presentation. There we go. Okay. Salt Lake City homelessness system and needs. There's some icons on here. You're going to see a lot of in this presentation because they're pretty simplified versions, grasp hopefully. This is the less simple version of what happens oftentimes. You'll see on the bottom left icon that's a tent for folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Just to the right of it are homeless resource centers. And so the arrows represent really basic concepts of how people move through and back and forth through the system at times. So if you start at the bottom left of the unsheltered tent, you can see that folks can go to the right to the resource centers at times. They can go top right to treatment. Usually that's a lot of social detox of the Volunteers of the American Detox Center. There's not a lot of folks who go directly from unsheltered county into traditional treatment programs like inpatient or outpatient treatment programs. It's pretty rare actually to do that. More likely they're going to go through the detox center first and then into treatment programs out there. Now they can also go directly into housing on the far right. And we do a lot of focus to make sure that you don't have to go to treatment or to resource centers to go into housing. The biggest issue is lack of housing right now. You can also see if you go to the left, actually straight up and down is the court. In Salt Lake City, you have the Justice Court. It has a homelessness court function to it. Judge Baxter ran that for a number of years. I think Judge Liu is running it now. We do that in the weekend day services center for Catholic Community Services. So that's a great benefit. But oftentimes folks end up in police interactions or in jail for a number of reasons into the court. Unsheltered homelessness, because there's no place to go from there back to jail. You can kind of see the system. Courts oftentimes at the top will refer folks into treatment directly if they see a need there. And oftentimes they'll go into residential treatment, if only because they don't have a place to live. Not necessarily because their substance use or mental illness is that severe, but because there's no place for them to be while they're treatment. That puts a big strain on the treatment community in a lot of ways. There's not enough beds for it. And then you can see treatment and housing are linked oftentimes where even if you complete, say, a treatment program, you still have a place to live. Some really great programs actually unify the two of those. We'll talk about that. Now, we've done a lot of research on even nationally and internationally. The cities that do well with this are systems that do a good job in helping folks move out of homelessness into stability, whatever that looks like for them. Live in this green triangle on the right-hand side. You have emergency services at the bottom, so resource centers, shelters, those kind of places, just to be safe, get access to services and basic needs. Treatment services are a big part for some folks, not everybody. We know about 30% of folks in the resource centers self-identify as having a mental illness diagnosed or a substance use disorder diagnosed. We do know that a much higher percentage of folks have experienced severe trauma. Either little t trauma we talk about, where it's the accumulated effect of a lot of struggles throughout life, or big T traumas. There are things you might think about as horrific events in their lives. And that sometimes manifests in their behaviors the same as it would for a mental illness or intoxication or substance use withdrawals. Because it can play havoc with some of your systems inside, your emotional regulation systems. Your ability to handle stress or when you feel stress. Your ability to interact with people and build healthy relationships or stable relationships. And so you get a lot of that with folks who are experiencing either sheltered or unsheltered homelessness. And then obviously housing ultimately is the root issue here we're talking about. Some folks may struggle to maintain housing, but what we're seeing more and more across this country at least is a lack of housing to begin with. And so it becomes more and more scarce. So folks who experience lower incomes, poverty, disabilities, whether fixed income, whatever it might be, are getting squeezed more and more out of the entire housing system completely. As pressure comes down through the different ranks of types of housing and the cost of housing, you'll see folks getting pushed out underneath. And part of that's directly not being able to compete for some units, but it's also because a lot of the units we used in Salt Lake County for a number of years that were older, naturally occurring affordable housing, have been sold and bought, renovated, sold at market rate, re-rented at market rate. We've lost that whole section of the housing component we've had for a number of years in this county. And that's not unique to us, it happens across the country. Now, what we're running into, and instead of a second ago, we talked about housing and treatment. Housing First is a model that's been validated nationally for a number of years now. Started on the East Coast years ago, Philadelphia. Basically, it was started as the end result of some research that said, if you can get stable into housing, everything else goes better. So why are we forcing, in some cases at that point even today, forcing folks to prove sobriety, to prove sort of stability from mental illness or symptoms thereof, to prove that they want something bad enough, essentially, to get into housing? Because if we reverse that, we say, well, let's get into housing and then do services, your outcomes are much, much better. And it sort of seems logical in some ways, and in other ways it feels unfair. And that's what we run into a lot, where it feels unfair to some folks because they say, well, housing's hard, you should have to prove to get it, and you're just gonna throw it away. And our argument, and the evidence supports this, is that when you're in a stable place where you know that you're a private place, you can store your private belongings, you can feel safer there, you're gonna do much better in a lot of ways because your symptoms, whether it's mental illness or other things, drop down, generally speaking. Oftentimes, folks who exhibit really high levels of substance use when they're unsheltered or in insecure locations, that drops as well. And so a lot of the symptoms we're seeing get better. And we need services for a lot of folks still, but that's what housing first is. That's really a great model. Now, it's hard because there's a lot of debate sometimes when things work well about does it work for everybody? Maybe not. And do you implement it correctly? Hopefully you do. But that's sort of the gold standard for what we see works. What we're seeing locally though, I'll actually go to camps now. So those who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, that bottom left in the tent. We've also looked at other cities that are doing a good job of resolving camps and moving camps away. But what they're doing is they're actually resolving camps into something positive. They'll go into a group of campers, whatever size, say 10 people camping, and they'll say, look, we've got 5 openings in a resource center or shelter. We've got 2 housing vouchers, and we've got a couple of immediate units open. We can get you all in today, this week, and next 2 weeks. And they'll do that over time with each of these and get them into services. So it's not like you're moving from one camp to another. You're vacating the camp into something more stable. That's what we try to build our program on now. And there are some limitations to it. You'll see that our resolution strategy in Salt Lake City is a rapid intervention team, it's a city team. We work with the county health department because sometimes it's a health issue out there. And we do outreach with Volunteers of America and other groups that will work with us to go to camps, get to know them, offer services, figure out what they need and what we can fit them up with. Obviously the services itself, cleaning around the camps and through the camps is needed. And then we also need no camping ordinance enforcement in some cases, because you want to resolve into these services. What we run into oftentimes is that we don't have a lot of options to get folks into. 2 years ago, the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, which includes providers, housing advocates, housing folks for the housing authorities and others, estimated that in Salt Lake County, we were short about 3,000 deeply affordable units. That means units for people who are making 40 or less % of the median income in the county. With the estimated that we'd probably be short another 1,400 per year for the next 3 years after that. So at the high end, perhaps, we might be short 5,800 units. Now, some units have been built since then. We've lost some others. It's hard to track exactly year to year, but that gives us a sense of why our housing market is so tight, particularly in this income level. Of that roughly 6,000 units, we needed about 870 of those to be permanent supportive housing, housing plus services, deeply affordable plus services attached to it. And that was based off about 450 initially 2 years ago, and another 210 per year we thought we were going to be short going forward for several years. This can be a little overwhelming, admittedly. We presented some legislation that was actually cost estimates because at the time, 2 years ago, the average cost for a new housing unit or renovated housing unit together was just under $300,000 per unit. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars to make this happen. In the bottom right, you're going to see that as of a few weeks ago, the projection for the need for emergency shelter for next winter, when we do emergency overflow for the colder temperatures, is 600 to 800. 600 base we need beds, in addition to our current resource center bed capacity, plus probably another 200 beds for the worst conditions, like code blue conditions, when it's below freezing, high precipitation, those kind of things. So this gives us a sense of, when I look at other cities and talk to them about their efforts, and they say, well, we resolve this camp into these services, some of those cities have had vacancies in the resource centers or their shelters. They've been underutilized, and so they can fill those up in an effective way, which is great. And Houston was a good example of a place that housed like 20,000 people over the last decade. Tremendous work. And they also have the ability to find 20,000 housing units in their metropolitan area. Now, what they've seen in the last couple of years is their housing market's actually gotten tighter like ours has, and it's getting harder for them as well. So we're not alone in this. When this doesn't work, we don't have the ability in that green triangle to get the positive outcomes, we end up living in this left-hand side as orange triangle, where folks who are unsheltered end up in a lot of places, I think we call it before the police have things. In government, sometimes this idea that, all right, there's a problem for the police have. You don't have another option. But oftentimes, a lot of cities, and we're not exempt from that in this county at all, use police and law enforcement to enforce camping ordinances as a way to try and mitigate camping. It's not a resolution in any way. And it makes it a very difficult thing because you end up with folks eventually getting charges depending on how your ordinance is written in your city. In our city, the camping ordinance is a misdemeanor, so it's a citation essentially, and a fine. Which you can imagine doesn't work for folks who are unsheltered. Even because we have a homeless court where you can resolve your fines through a number of ways. And they're trying not to use fines or citations. And generally when folks go out, when we don't use police for camp cleanups, it's our professional teams, but folks will move if they're given a 48-hour notice, generally speaking. But you end up in this cycle here. And particularly to see, I think California is probably a good or bad example of this, where they get frustrated because they can't get the positive outcomes, and so you start changing the laws. That's where that court thing comes up. Start tightening your laws or changing them to try and be more specific about camping, loitering, those kind of issues. This cycle here ends up looking like this. This is sort of a death spiral in a lot of ways. People don't get out of it very well. Municipalities don't get out of it financially. You can't win this. No matter how many resources you throw at this.
Andrew, if I can ask a question really quickly, I'm back on the right side of your screen. At the last Salt Lake Valley Commission on Homelessness group meeting, it sounded like there was going to be a gap of 10 days to 2 weeks between the closing of the winter shelters and the ability to meet that capacity elsewhere. It seems to me if this is the model we're trying to follow, it's a huge missed opportunity to move the people in that green triangle. That you're essentially the deadline on closing of the winter shelters is kicking into the left side of the screen.
Yeah, so I'll get to that in a second, actually. Yes.
Anticipating your presentation.
No, I think that was clearly the intention to try and, because it's only a winter seasonal shelter option, right? And by definition goes away because of the locations, the funding isn't sufficient for year-round and the staffing isn't sufficient, that there was going to be this drop-off every year. The worst day of the year for the shelter providers was actually Monday this week, because that's the morning when they couldn't use those 130 beds that are still being used. It's awful for everybody involved. Now, this is what we're trying to avoid. This is not a win for anybody. So the next slide, to your point, Salt Lake City itself has tried to invest in permanent storage housing for a number of years. And in the last 3 years now, we've had 340 units open, plus another 291 under construction. Now, the 400, as a part of this, that the mayor talked about. And so the first 94 of those will open this Friday. So there's a gap, not as much as we hoped. The other two projects we talked about, the Medically Vulnerable Program, which was funded through the city and the state, that has been delayed. It's going to another city outside of Salt Lake City in the county. They're trying to get the land under ownership and get the municipality process moving. It's taking longer than they thought. So they're planning on probably July, August to open that up. Not the worst thing, but the best thing. We wanted it immediately. The third one is the family shelter. We don't talk about families much, but there is a need for more families. Oftentimes when the economy struggles and jobs struggle, we see more families experiencing homelessness. It's one of those tests for us. The job market is still good, the housing market is very bad. So we have seen an increase in families, and we've also seen some influx of families from outside the country coming, looking for asylum, other things, and that's been an interesting change in dynamic here locally. My unique to us either, I used to live in Maine, and they built a new shelter just outside of Portland for 270 people, I want to say, give or take. And about 70% of those are gonna go to folks who have been immigrating in from Central and South America mostly. It's moving across the country that way, so there's a lot of need out there because the housing's so hard. You still need all three of these here. Now, the third one is a particularly important one because the other two are sort of transitional housing or housing in a lot of ways. Things we've invested for housing. The shelter would be emergency and temporary, families would be year-round. The lowest barrier emergency shelter would be trying to help address that big gap, the 600 to 800 bed gap you've got. Part of that's historical from the transition from the old road home downtown to the new centers, because there was a gap of at least 300 plus at that point that was never filled. And it's probably grown since then to what we see today. So Wayne Eagerhouse with the state of Utah is looking at where to put a lowest barrier emergency shelter. We're working with them on that because it's probably going to have to be somewhere centrally located, reasonably in the county, to help fill that need.
So I recall a HUD report on best practices from a few years ago. That basically says the best place for shelters is where the population are and the services are. I know that's kind of the antithesis of what the city's approach has been of trying to spread it around, but I think we've seen with the 3 instead of 4 shelters or homeless resource centers that we got, that the population isn't following to where the source of the resource centers are. They're staying located near the city center. So I don't want to throw you off on a tangent here too much, but I think that point that was brought up back then, 4 years ago, has kind of been proven true, that the homeless resource centers need to be where the homeless population is.
There's a combination of factors, it is true. And one factor has also been that the only day services outside of the resource centers is on Rio Grande. It's never moved. Fortunately, medical clinic never moved either. The shelter itself, for overnight, didn't move. But you can see the draw, and your point is right, that it's also habit. It's where the other opportunities are. We know that 74% of the permanent supported housing in the county is located in Salt Lake City. 340. So there's not a lot of housing either out there for us. We also know that, relatively speaking, that the dispersed model is a good model overall if you're fully funded, and you have the transportation piece. So one thing they built in was shuttles between all the locations. So it is possible to do it, but your point is right, that folks are going to gravitate to where they get the services and they feel most comfortable. The other piece that's happened as well is that we've, for a lot of years, folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness consistently for a long period of time, oftentimes hid. They weren't very visible, they didn't try to be visible. Even if they were downtown, they weren't sort of right in the middle of the Main Street, State Street corners. They were in less observed locations. Foothills have always been a big draw. The Jordan has been a huge draw for a number of years. Pretty far south, actually. But we've also seen a tightening in enforcement in other locations as well. And we don't want to pick fights with everybody and sort of jurisdictional battles this way, but as everybody tightens, everything flows one way or the other, right? Particularly in the wintertime when the overflows end up here. So this winter we had an overflow in Mill Creek, and they're great to host it, but it shut down in the daytime, so they built everybody downtown and dropped them off the way back. So of course, right? There's a lot of factors involved in that. So it is an interesting system because we have kind of dispersed to some extent. When you get the transportation and the housing pieces, you can do it, but we're not quite there yet.
Mr. Johnson, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the resource centers are not available during the day.
The overflow liquor is not this year, just for winter time. The other resource centers, the Geraldine and King here in town, 7 South, the Miller Resource Center on 14 South, about 3rd West, and then the Pamela Atkinson one in South Salt Lake. Those are 24/7 year round. There are also places where you can stay all day, you can have services on site, meals, storage, you can have pets with you, all those kind of things.
So why isn't the city able to open more daytime shelters for people as an alternative to getting them off the camps and off the streets?
There's a gap in the emergency services system, like I said before. That system is funded by state money for the most part. The city contributes other pieces, but the base funding statewide is state money. So there's not enough state money. And that's a first piece to acknowledge that. They've been running a deficit of about $6 million per year for the operators, just to operate those. This year, the legislature increased the funding by $12 million per year. Should be ongoing as the next year we go. So that helps take care of that, but it's also still limited because it means you have a lot of options to get more services in place. The other thing we've seen limiting this is locations, finding the right location because of the cost of the capital. The biggest issue in the last 2 years has been the staff. Nobody can hire enough staff to keep them. And one of the things that we've always done is that people are poorly paid for these jobs.
Is it possible to actually hire the homeless to help run some of these services and somewhat be self-sustaining in that way?
Yeah, I think that's a model out there, and some agencies use those in different ways. Treatment programs sometimes use a peer-to-peer model for treatment services. In the other provider networks, oftentimes they want a bit of a buffer. If you're living in a resource center, they don't want you sort of working in that resource center because it causes problems within there with you and your peers as well. So there are folks that have lived in resource centers and worked in other ones, or folks that we actually use advantage services for our street cleanings and our city water work that way. And they hire a lot of folks who are experiencing homelessness now or formerly homeless. So that is a good model for it. When they're overlapping too much with what the services they're getting, it can cause problems. And so folks are careful on that sort of thing.
Isn't the Other Side Academy model that they're putting for the tiny home village going to require the people, I don't know what the word they would use, clients or residents are going to be required to work there, from my understanding of it? Is that
They won't be required, but they'll be strongly encouraged to put it that way. So the Other Side Academy on 70 East and South runs a treatment program essentially. Somewhat a treatment program. It's a life skills program that's based on discipline and working period for peer supervision. So as you live there, you become responsible for a dorm essentially, and you oversee them in the work environment too. So they run some social enterprise functions that way, and folks work there. In the village, they'll have social enterprise endeavors. I think they're talking about a bakery, grabs cookies. Obviously, they have a movie company, for store stuff, they have a variety of things. And they'll encourage folks, but you're not required to work in their industry, you can work anywhere if you live there. And some treatment programs like an Odyssey House model where they'll do peer-to-peer work. So dorms are run by residents who live there, but they're supervised by other folks as well.
So Mr. Johnson, how do you address the issue that is raised by some people, not necessarily myself, I'm just echoing, that the more services that Salt Lake City provides for homeless, the more Salt Lake City will be a magnet for homeless.
Mm-hmm.
So that people from other jurisdictions will want to come here because there are more services, there's more housing, there's more of everything that they don't get in other jurisdictions.
Sure. I think if you talk about it in a local sense from the Wasatch Front, it's been a big consideration for us, even the state of Utah overall. We know that there's very few services in a lot of parts of the state, regardless, whether it's housing, treatment services, mental health, substance use, whatever it is. So we've always had a big draw to the centers. St. George has always been one, obviously, so in Utah. Salt Lake City for the other one. Counties are responsible for that, but oftentimes they don't have a full variety of services. So that's a consideration. The mayors try to strike a tone of stepping into the space and trying to help lead, but being very clear that we've got to do it together with the state and county and other cities. The example that's frustrating but also helpful, I think, is the process is set up to select winter overflow locations. And that's a state process, but they say last year was every city in Salt Lake County had to have a delegate to this group, this working group. And you work through as a group to figure out where they're going to go, and then theoretically how you're going to pay for it and all those kind of things. It's a hard process because not everybody's always in the health skin in the game, right? Not everybody's fully invested in that because either they don't believe it's going to come to their city or it's not that big a deal for them. And so you end up with a small number of cities taking a lot of this. The positive part of that has been 2 cities who before hadn't really been engaged in this way. Actually, after that process was over, a lot of the cities said, I didn't know how hard it was and the full scale of what we're talking about here until I participated in this. And 2 cities afterwards came up and said, look, we've got properties that we think could be helpful for the system if you use them for, say, shelter or treatment or whatever it is. and they volunteered. That's new. The other thing that's new is Wayne Niederhauser's role in the state of Utah. It's hard to overstate the importance of somebody who's in his position being able to say the same things that providers and advocates have been saying for a lot of years, but say in a way that gets the attention of policymakers. And you see that partially because of the $50 to $55 million in deeply affordable housing that were allocated the last 2 years in the state. But also, there's a housing grant for the first time that's not going. It's essentially a voucher for folks with low incomes to get housing. You'll see that the services delivery support and the discussions that are happening. So that's a maddeningly slow process, but it's critical to get everything you said. Everyone's got to start paying attention and being a part of this. Otherwise, it's always going to be 3 cities in the state that are going to handle this. It's not as fast as I would have hoped. To your point earlier, people do tend to congregate to places where there are resources. So they're really there's a couple of things. One is we need emergency beds, we talked about here, and that needs to be a little more dispersed for a lot of reasons. But the second thing is we gotta have housing be shared everywhere. And that's not just for this need, it's for the whole state and all housing. The state has a mandate on every city above a certain size in the state to have a moderate income housing plan. And they have to report on that every year to the state of Utah about what their plans are to promote affordable housing and then what they're doing. And to this point, there haven't really been sort of penalties for it. It's more of a, let's be aware of this and show us what you're willing to do. But that's critical because if only a handful of cities are doing more density and doing permanent supportive housing, whatever it is, it's always going to look like this. And the hard piece for the city is trying to step into that gap and saying, look, we could really just take this all on, but then nothing changes because we can't possibly carry the load for this in the city. You get stuck in that cycle and you couldn't fund it enough, you couldn't build enough. Unless we've got 5 cities, 10 cities, we've got the whole county. County mayor's been very good about this anymore. And the state of Utah saying this is really a statewide issue. The thing that comes up, maybe correlated with what you said, or adjunct piece, is there are statements made at times like, if Salt Lake City or Utah looks too attractive for folks experiencing homelessness, they'll all move in. Somewhat. I can't say that doesn't happen because it happens everywhere. Every city I talk to is angry about people being bused into their city from somewhere else. Every single one. And every single city I'm aware of actually has a program that allows one-way bus tickets out, including us, to go back home to where you came from, where you lived, and where if family can prove that you live with them, there are nonprofits that will send people on one-way buses where they're going to go. Even fly. New York City did flights out of the country. So that's not unique. I think that the migration piece is a bit overstated at times because a lot of us would move under the wrong or right circumstances, right? If we had to for some reason or we felt like it was important, away from people we know to a new place that we didn't really know well. Generally, folks are coming here because they already knew here or they have somebody who they know or they grew up here. Folks experiencing homelessness are not that different. They're not necessarily just going to pick up and leave in mass numbers because they hear a story about free housing. Some might. Everyone's a little bit geographically oriented, where if you're more comfortable, you develop networks of providers that folks come street with you. You have family generally somewhere close by-ish, or you develop it over time. So I worry a little less about that, although it is a consideration. I worry more about us not doing it because we're worried about being too good at it. And I think that's a recipe for disaster for the whole country. If we're all protecting that piece because we don't want anybody to find out we're doing a good job, so we're not going to do enough. We're good about not doing enough.
Well, getting back to that question, a lot of people fear homeless people. There's a safety issue here. There's a disruption of commercial commerce, the retail sales and things like that. On the other hand, I think it is difficult, maybe impossible, to move people off the street out of encampments if you don't have an alternative setting where they can go. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you could say to somebody, you can't camp here, but then where do you send them, right, without an alternative? Isn't it possible for the city, maybe with the support of the state and other municipalities, to create low-cost housing alternatives. Not necessarily the tiny homes alternative, but, military-style tents, where people can find shelter, where you can put in temporary sanitary facilities for people to get clean, and do it in a low-cost way, utilizing some of the vacant land that exists around the city, and provide an alternative, so that when you go to somebody that's camped in front of Nordstrom's, you can say, you can't camp here, but you can go there, and that's your alternative, and if you don't go there, then we have to move you elsewhere.
So if you'll see number 3 here on the slide, and the yellow still needed, that's exactly what that refers to, the lowest barrier emergency shelter option. There's various ways to do this. We've seen across the country places where it's not gone well at all. Generally, those are places where you open up a piece of land, come on camp here, bring your stuff, set it up, maybe some support from us, but not nearly enough. That generally devolves into much worse. Maybe equivalent to what we saw in Rio Grande 5 to 6 years ago, where we had a perimeter around Rio Grande Fifth West, and we had 1,000 people down there every day, and it was run by folks who were coming in, generally the cartels. Did a lot of that. They took over the bathrooms. They ran. Half the people down there were not experiencing homelessness. We had folks coming in from all across the state just buying drugs and human trafficking. That's what we're trying to avoid. What's worked well is you take a piece of land, you define a very clear perimeter to it, right? Here's the boundaries of it. You have an intake and exit process. You have rules. You have some self-governing in there. You've got a professional provider providing the services you in the resource center. And you also generally have consistent housing, whether it's mod pods, tents that are set up that are uniform, or something more stable, whatever it is. But it's not necessarily everyone's sort of built their own mini mansion in there and then you accumulate stuff. Those have worked well. And we actually visited Reno a few weeks ago with the state of Utah and the county and looked at some things they did for COVID dollars, similar to that. And so when you hear House is working with us right now, that exact concept, the difficulty is always land, to be honest with you. Especially the land prices now, so even buying land is hard, trying to get state or county or city owned property that's big enough is a little difficult. But we were working through that because that's the idea.
I've got a question. What about the idea of using like abandoned hotels? I know Switchpoint's doing that on the west side. How does that go? And what comes of that?
Yeah, during COVID, it was funny. The first year I got cold called about Class C motels across the county, and they offered them up for 100 units. It was usually an average of about $20 million. Now for them, that's good cash flow. For us, it was not cheap, but not the worst of the time. But nobody had that much money on site to sort of do it. So you look at Switchpoint, which is a great net space. They've actually found Class C motels that were for sale, bought them on credit essentially, and then tried to backfill and have to pay them off. So Switchpoint's done 2 here, 1 in St. George, I believe, looking more. Shelter the Homeless is doing a similar thing in the county right now with Class C motels, I think. So you see a lot of that. A lot of those motels that businesses start selling off. So in California, they had $1 billion set aside just for that. And so I get called from real estate agents in California, representing folks here as well, saying, hey, you guys have a lot of money, so we do. I'll sell all my stuff to you. So unfortunately, our state did not set that up that way yet. But yeah, that's been a low-hanging fruit for a lot of reasons. I don't know what the consequences are because for a lot of years, that was part of our sort of naturally occurring affordable housing. Some of those motels on, say, State Street, North Temple, not all of them, some of them ended up being long-term rentals essentially for folks who were working. And losing those means we sort of displace some folks, so we're not quite sure what the impact is there. We're probably still grappling with that. The other thing that's happening in other cities that have higher commercial rates than we do are they're taking vacant office buildings and renting them into housing. Our market here has not been to the point where that made fiscal sense to do that quite yet. But you can see other cities sort of grappling with empty space everywhere and how to use it better to help the housing situation.
So we can circle back to what you were saying before and kind of bounce off of this. When you presented a year ago, when we were talking about it, you had identified the problem and had quite a few solutions to the problem, but it always came down to a lack of funding.
Mhm.
So it's more about triage and figuring out what to do with the amount of funds we have. You're optimistic that with Wayne Niederhauser being involved with his connections with the legislature and the former senator, that things would be getting better. It sounds like things have moved in that track, and now it's no longer the top down as much as it is getting the buy-in from the other municipalities going horizontally. So I guess what I'm just asking is to encapsulate, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think the multiple fronts. One is you gotta have public investment money. City can do $60 million over 5 years, which we've done. States gotta do more than 2-3 million a year. Now, all the money so far has been pandemic or stimulus money. Let's be clear about that. The 100 million so far in the last 2 years is federal funds. We need a more consistent funding mechanism because it's gonna take us a long time to build housing consistently. We've done it before, we've been very successful at Permanent Affordable Housing. 20 years ago, we built 400 units in Salt Lake City and Midvale, and really cut down the shelter population dramatically. The Great Road Home downtown was pretty relatively empty, but we stopped building. The Great Recession, a number of things came in. So that consistency is a big piece from the state, county, city level going forward in all cities. The second piece is we've also got to get the right services in the right places. So we have a shortage of emergency shelter beds. It's got to be addressed. And that's part of this right here. We've got a shortage of permanent supportive housing specifically for folks with mental illness or similar issues. We've got to have more of that. And then that funding source for the services piece. So yes, it's an education piece across all cities to participate in that process. And it's making sure that all levels of government are participating financially and otherwise. And we can get actually to the third point about services. If you've heard about the Miami models been thrown around a lot, sequential intercept. This might have the potential address that last piece. So we went to Miami, Florida on recommendation from a number of folks based on what they've done for about 20 years down there. And what we saw was 20 years ago, there was a particular judge in Miami-Dade County who had a young man in his early 30s, I want to say, who came before him. The parents of the young man talked to him and said, look, we really need help for your son. He's like, well, yeah, we must have services like for mental health issues, so you get in and out of jail a lot. And they said, well, you might be surprised. And what he found out was there weren't. He tried to refer him to services, and what they did was essentially a competency hearing. And they went back to the court, and they couldn't do anything with him because he was so mentally ill that he got released. There wasn't a treatment option or housing. And they found out that this particular individual who was in front of them had been the chief of psychiatry at the hospital there, Harvard trained. And even he and his family couldn't access services. So this judge basically, from his court here, went and said, what do we need? If I'm going to sit in front of folks and tell them their services, we got to have them. So he went to the community and helped raise money. He started treatment services and resource center stuff in the private community. He did a lot of work that way, and then they expanded over time to draw their jails, police forces, etc., and try and get all levels inside Miami-Dade County. And by their report, there are about 3.2 million people in the county, twice the size of us essentially. They've got about 1,000 people who experience homelessness, shelter homelessness per year. Now, they're basically where Southern California and some of the West Coast cities, they're basically equivalent in the 90s, the number of folks they have. And they've diverse significantly in years since then about how they handle this. So it's called sequential intercept because what they said is we are going to try and get everywhere in this system we can to divert into the positive area, out of jail and shelterless courts into treatment, housing, resource center, whatever it is, every possible level. So they start with intercept 0, go to intercept 5. And before criminal justice involvement, they try to have enough services, just voluntary services in their county, so somebody can call up for help. We actually have that here in Salt Lake County, it's just not enough. We have a mobile crisis outreach team. We've got the social detox piece and Huntsman Mental Health Center. We've got a number of things, we need more of them. Intercept 1 for them is the first time police are called for some situation, whatever it is. Can they get them into something before they have to arrest them? And so we have a receiving center, but it only has 6 beds until this year. Now we have 12 beds. But we need far more than that, so we're building a new one in South Salt Lake. That's a good model to avoid jailing folks. And step 2 is, if you have to arrest somebody, when they get into the jail, their first screening is to screen them out of possible disturbances. Right? If you book somebody, the first part they're doing is moving them into a treatment center if they can, off-site. Anywhere else they can. There's a legal element to that, but they found a way to do that more effectively. And then their third one is, if you're in jail, do you have enough services in there to stabilize medication, everything else you can do, and working with the judges. So intercept 4 is, once you get out of jail for some reason, how do you reintegrate back in the community? Do you get released? Like, we do releases a lot from the jail, but we average about 50 to 70 per week between like midnight and 5 a.m. You walk out of the county jail at 2 in the morning, where are you gonna go? There's just no place, right? And so they've done a good job there trying to make sure there's always a landing spot for folks. 4 is that reentry again, and 5 is long-term stuff. And that is, how do you not come back into jail? Do you have enough services for your housing, for other treatment services, housing first, whatever it is, and they've got 5 resource centers in Miami-Dade County, basically like ours are. How do you make sure folks don't come back in? And that's why they've done a good job over the years, as well as anybody that I'm aware of, dealing with this. And this is what we're trying to emulate. We have a lot of these already in our county system, but not enough. And then our housing and treatment services have to expand. That's the idea here. Now, the top right there, they saw like County Criminal Justice Advisory Council. So the county is taking this on officially within that council. So they are going to lead this effort. So we don't have to, as a city, or that effort again to make sure all levels of government are involved in this piece. That is a lot. The piece that I haven't mentioned much of is what's the role of the private community. The other thing that was surprising to me personally when I went to Miami for was they've done some really interesting things progressively for a long time. They have statewide real estate tax that goes towards home services. So I've heard of here. They also went to their business communities, particularly the hospitality community, and they asked them for a 1% tax. 20 years, 15 years ago, maybe 10. And they generate $30 million a year in that county for it, and they do it all towards these services. They took that money and they leveraged it with federal HUD money, so they basically doubled it essentially every year. $60 million say on that. We're running statewide around 18, well, 30, not 12 for all that, right? Not including Medicaid. And they haven't even expanded Medicaid for it. And they're doing this without a lot of Medicaid support. We haven't been able to do that here locally. I think one of our big objectives in the state is, when they set up the new state homelessness council a couple of years ago with the Newberry organization, there is a philanthropic element here called the collective impact group, I believe, I forget what it was. And that was private money that were going to be part of the system, and we haven't really integrated that very well. I think there's a lot of work to be done to get more private support into the system and work more cohesively together. That's probably a big objective in the next few years, I think. So that's essentially the Miami model, if you hear about that. So the county is running it here locally. We've got support from the state for it. We've got everybody involved from every court you can, from all the police departments, as many as you can, legal defenders, the district attorney's office, obviously the judges are a big piece with the jail. We've got to have our treatment providers involved in this. And what they did in Florida also is that the private hospitals all commit to, if you refer somebody, they would assess them within like 7 days with a psychiatrist. That's hard. It's ambitious for us, but that's the kind of thing we have to do to make sure this works better. So this is a big piece to that, kind of missing part of the component. We've got about 60% of the folks that come to our resource centers that self-resolve out back into the community, and they'll come back again. But most of the attention is paid on the small number of people who are very visible because of mental illness, substance use, trauma, whatever it is, who really struggle to reintegrate. And we haven't done a great job as a system of making sure they have the right resources. This is a big piece of it, housing is a big piece of it. And then filling those gaps, peer support, case management, ACT teams, there's a lot of things we do.
So coming back around to it again, what has to be done to get, as Commissioner Terry pointed out, with the switch point model that seems to be successful? Got partners, cold calling you to try to get involved with it. All it requires is the money. In the case of this, like a 1% hospitality industry tax, what needs to be done to get the wheels moving on things like that and try to get the legislature moving?
I'd say Switchpoint's a good example of a different model, which I like. They haven't gone through the tax credit process. So what they've done generally is they find a property, they buy it, and sometimes they leverage themselves to do that. It's okay. And then they'll cobble together services money, and then they'll have a social enterprise piece where they'll business of some sort to bring it around, right? But they'll also charge, in these cases, $450 a month. So they're really targeting folks with fixed incomes, seniors, veterans, folks with disability payments. And so they can do it for that price with all these other supports in place. So it's a good model that way. We've got another one on North Temple that is not going to use that model, but similar in that you're going to get vouchers and housing vouchers. Other side village, the tiny home village is going to operate on their model. So we need a variety of these things. But the key piece
The Ramada, wasn't the Ramada Inn pretty successful, but it was temporary?
that was temporary, but there's a private developer who is for profit actually, who's turning into affordable housing, 197 units. So he's probably starting in June, 50 units, 40 units a month through the summer to October, a month. So we need a variety of those things, and we've got a number of the projects, Pamela's Place 2 on Fifth West, Spark on North Temple, a couple other things that are moving forward. The big thing we found also locally is that there's a lack of information at times. There's this new state strategic plan, 3 to 5 year plan for the whole state for homelessness. And it identifies some good things in there. And what we're doing now is making sure everybody's aware that there's a plan. Funders, everybody else. Here are the objectives we gotta get. With Wayne, we're talking through, if I go back a few of these to the needs, this one in particular, as we talked about earlier. Here's what we gotta do. We gotta get these three housing programs online. We gotta get more emergency shelter for this fall, year round, we hope, and then more family beds. And then build on the successes that he's done. And so part of Wayne's job, frankly, is he gets $15 million from the legislature that's available say July 1st. He's got to get that out the door as soon as possible, and he's got to show progress within, say, 6 months. So the next legislative session, he can point to those units for those programs. If you can't do that, then it's hard to get more investment that way. And then we also have the metrics. I think our data is going to have to be a huge piece in telling the story going forward. The big issue for us, though, to direct with you, is that we can target small groups and help services that way, particularly with folks with mental illness, substance use, physical disabilities, heavy trauma, whatever it is, and build those units. Our overall homelessness issue is going to be more tied to our housing rates. In places across the country that have high housing costs for rent or home ownership, they have a high number of folks like this. But places that have low housing costs have fewer folks. So housing, all levels of housing is going to be critical for us across the board, and then we have to invest in the services for that, those populations that get the most attention.
Has any thought been given to using private residences to house homes? Because there are lots of residences that have vacant rooms, multiple rooms, attached living spaces, and not all the homeless are dangerous with severe mental illness. A lot of them are, mothers with children that could just use a warm bed. And has the city given any thought to offering financial incentives to private homeowners for housing the unsheltered? For instance, rebates on their property taxes or exemptions from the payment of property taxes in exchange for housing homeless.
Yeah, so the incentive piece, the property tax for county level things, they have to handle that part. We looked at a model out of Seattle actually that used accessory dwelling units that were usually external in that case, for that very purpose, where you would sublease a small footprint of your backyard. They would build the building for free essentially. And then the agreement was every, like a 3-year lease or something, house an individual who's experiencing homelessness there for just free. So the homeowner doesn't get more money necessarily, but it's out of the benefit what they see to the community. It's been pretty limited, and they've had to be very careful in matching the right person to the right place in both ways, because they don't want a homeowner who's going to be exploitative, which is a big issue at times. And they don't want somebody who may not fit that homeowner's family or the neighborhood. And they actually asked the whole neighborhood to weigh in on these things, which makes it prohibitive. The thing that's already happening, which is positive, is that when folks present at a resource center or call up for help, the first thing that's always done is a diversion effort. Identify family, friends, anywhere else you can be, because you're right, families more likely to take somebody back in, that's somebody they don't know. And some folks who are experiencing homelessness don't feel comfortable either in those situations, so finding the right balance there. I think accessory dwelling units, frankly, are a big thing that's underutilized across the Wasatch Front. Not just for this purpose, but all purposes to increase housing in those different ways. And it's also, it feels different than a large apartment building. So a lot of our public housing is 30, 60, 100 units in a highway, essentially. It's like a file cabinet in some ways, right? So if you're not used to that, it's a little overwhelming. And accessory dwelling in the backyard feels different, less claustrophobic, it's quieter oftentimes. So I think there's a big need for that particular piece of area.
So having followed the ADU issue pretty closely on the West Side Coalition and Roseburg Community Council, other hats I wear, the big obstacle is it's cost prohibitive. It's not zoning. It's not neighborhood based. It's just they're expensive. So that might be something to revisit down the road, that we modify the ADU's requirements in Salt Lake City. If somebody were willing to build it for a property owner in exchange for housing the house, I see that as a win-win.
Yeah, we've talked to various companies about prefab models that are cheaper, because some of it's just the cost of the unit. Some of it's utility hookup, that's really gone through the roof in the last few years. I think Modal's one of those local companies been around for a bit, their prices like doubled during the pandemic. I mean, literally, it was phenomenal. So, I think it's underutilized. I think there are incentives that can be used differently. I agree. I like the policy idea. It's actually part of the modern income housing plan for a lot of cities, and they would allow them. So I'd like to see a lot more of that. Obviously, we need more density in general. And then we need, for the housing itself, we need more laborers, we need more skilled contractors, we need all sorts of things. We need different building laws, frankly. There's a lot of needs there.
So we are running out of time. We've almost taken up your whole hour. So if I could, if anybody else has a pressing question?
I have a pressing question.
Yes.
What, Mr. Johnson, do you think this commission can do to help advance the rights of people experiencing homelessness in our city?
I think that the Southern Valley Coalition on Homelessness, which is the local authority in this county, one of their initiatives has been to examine their diversity and inclusion issues. That's racial, that's gender, but that's also disability or ability issues, right? I think they could use some more support. I've done a poor job, frankly, in linking the two. The second piece is we need, I know the whole city's under looking at all policies everywhere. But I think in our housing discussions particularly, it could be helpful. I think there's a lot of blind spots. And I know I have blind spots that aren't there. So I think from my end, I can do better about trying to link your expertise with, say, the Valley Coalition, which is a good starting point. Because really they're who we work through for a lot of this stuff. Because we need the right housing, but we also need the policies and prioritization that helps folks. And that's been a struggle for us in a lot of ways. Because we have such a need, it's hard to know who's the most vulnerable at times, and then what are the types of things being built, where they're being built, what are the services that they're missing when they get built, even our resource centers themselves.
So I did join the Salt Lake Valley Commission in homelessness on your recommendation last year, and what I learned was how much I don't know. It's massive, and there's a lot of people who are infinitely way more qualified than me already, elbow deep on that issue. So it's more of an info dump for me when I participate. And right now there's a lot of reorg going on, I believe. So I'm not really sure where I fit in with that.
Some of their goals, though, overlap here. They've been very explicit in saying that they need to improve in their inclusion stuff. And I don't know if that dovetails with some expertise you might have or others might have, but I'm not convinced yet that we're there. from a coalition perspective of providers. So I need to do better about that, I think, in my end as well.
But I think our position here as a, you know, part-time volunteer, commissioner for the city, we can do a lot of issue advocacy. You know, not really throw our weight around, but our name around a little bit if you need help in that category.
So much of our work is housing related. I mean, I'm a homelessness policy guy, but housing is it, right? So I end up living in that realm a lot, even though I'm not the expert there. And I think for the city, and that's one of the places where the city has responsibility, zoning, housing incentives, particularly the types of housing, where we go those kind of questions. And I think we could do a lot more for integrating our expertise in those discussions and what we want from home, frankly, from the city. And
Please reach out to us if you have something specific that we could assist on. Real fast, after Commissioner Armio asked their question, could you give us an update what's going on with Homeless Resource Center text amendment? Because I think that's coming out.
Oh, yes, tonight.
I believe Commissioner Armio has a question.
No, it was more a comment. I was just gonna say thank you for all the information you provided us. It's an absolutely complex situation, and you do a great job at what you do. Thank you.
And before we dismiss Mr. Johnson, I'd like to move that we add these slides to the minutes of this meeting.
So can I get that?
Yeah.
I moved it. Any second?
I don't even think we need to hold a vote on that. We can just make the request. Okay, provide the slides for us.
I can definitely do that.
Yeah.
The housing text amendment is on the agenda tonight for potential action by the council. There's still a couple of discussion points about some details in there. One of which is firearms piece about storing on site versus not on site, things like that. I'll anticipate they're gonna take a vote tonight regardless, because if they don't, then it reverts back to the old conditional use process, which I don't think the council wants, from what they said so far. The current proposal, as it's written, would increase the number of zones you could have a resource center in from 3 to everything except for 2 of them, I believe. So except for manufacturing 1 and 2, the manufacturing zones, every other zone would be available going forward. But the trade-off is that there's no conditional use anymore, but the city council has ultimate say over every one of those applications. But a lot of responsibility from the council side, it gives them more authority to think through, ask questions, put restrictions on an applicant. So that's the trade-off they're gonna look at tonight. And there's some details in there as well that the process itself, we're still goes to the planning commission, but their recommendation goes to the city council. The city council makes a determination based on factors that they're not shall do this, they're more of consider these things. Proximity to other resources, transportation, how close they are to existing resource centers, et cetera, those kind of things.
Well, in my opinion, this all goes back to 5 years ago when the word home was being shut down and being replaced by 4 homeless resource centers. And it got downsized to 3. We're still playing catch up with that. We don't meet the capacity, we don't have the capacity, it meets the needs. The resources aren't where they need to be. It's been 4 years of triage and putting out fires rather than even meeting the needs that were there 5 years ago. So anything that can get us back to full capacity is appreciated.
I'd say the other thing that's not talked about much is that there is, to my knowledge, there is not another city in this county that has a zone for resource centers. It doesn't allow them. It's not talked about much. We get the attention to the capital city, et cetera, but I think if this passes, or even if it doesn't pass, it reverts back to the old conditional use process. We're still the only city that allows them. And that's hard. It's very difficult to sort of have that on the books. So another change in state legislation this year was in 2 years, Davis County and Utah County both have to have plans for emergency overflow in their time. And so that is another step forward. I like that we're taking, say, 3 steps forward and a step or 2 back. You know, sometimes it feels like it's the inverse. But I think our overall direction is right, but it's a long, hard process to get where we're going. But it's worth it. I think ultimately there's nothing more worth it than what we're doing.
Thank you.
Okay. Did anybody online have any questions? You guys have been pretty quiet.
It's just.
Hi there. This question is for Michelle. Michelle, when we watch this video online, is the audio much better? Like clear? You know?
It should be.
Okay, because I had a very hard time hearing. So, Mr. Andrew Johnston?
Is that my fault, Esther?
No, I was gonna ask you if I can have my own presentation. No, I'm just kidding. I'll go back and watch the video. But Andrew, thank you so much for all that you do, and thank you for coming out and sharing a little piece of that with us. I know the homeless situation and just housing the homeless is a very complex thing. And I'm just grateful that you're willing to step up and be a part of like that solution. So thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Esther.
You know, Esther, I have the same problem when I listen to these meetings, when I'm virtual. And I think part of the problem is the location, the room.
Yes, the
has a
room.
Really, really bad echo. And it reverberates, and it's very difficult to hear. So we can find a better location, a more intimate setting where it's not such a massive ceiling. It might make communication a little easier. Now, it may not even be possible, but I have noticed the same problem that Esther experienced tonight. It's just hard to hear. It's even hard to hear when we're, 10 yards away.
A balcony you could use.
I want to vote for instead of discussion, we just start our own a cappella group in here. It'll be much better use of the space. All right, back to you.
All right, thank you. I think, thank you for coming and presenting again. I really appreciate the comprehensive view, and I'd like to see that we are moving in the right direction. Remember, progress is progress.
Gotta believe.
So we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is to review our subcommittee goals and priorities. I think we covered homelessness pretty well just over the last hour. So is there an update, Michelle, on CDOT?
Yes, kind of, but for CDOT, I just need everyone's availability. I'm hoping to have, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this last meeting or not, but just informational sessions, probably 2, and people can reserve or RSVP for one or the other, or they can come to both if they want to, and this will be within the community. I need to get an update from Damien because he was gonna meet with Sandra Stokes and ask about the YWCA as one possible location. And the second one, we're hoping to get confirmation from, wow, I'm just blanking on it. Ancestry, why am I blanking on it? I have it written down. I'll get back to you on it. It's Restoring Ancestry, am I saying that right or wrong? Okay, well, it's in Salt Lake City. I think I'm just messing up on the name.
So, Michelle, are you looking for dates?
If you have dates, I know that it's might not be for everyone to come, like type of thing, like I know it's summer, everyone's traveling, but whoever can come, it would be nice to have the commissioners there, as well as we're trying to work with mayor's schedule too, so really.
Can we do this as a do a poll or something like that, or do you want us to just individually give you random dates that are available?
Well, honestly, it is probably gonna work around mayor's needs.
So
I'm just giving an update.
If you can narrow it down to what the mayor's dates are, then we can probably fit in.
Yeah, it's a little hard to do it in a vacuum. So if you can suggest some dates that would work and see if we can confirm, or send out a doodle poll, and we'll tell you the dates are available.
Yes, I'm just giving the update on it, like nothing's planned yet because it's a tough schedule.
Okay,
So
I
it's
thought
gonna
you were
be-
just asking us for dates that were available.
Oh, yeah, no,
Okay.
I'm just giving an update, that's what we're thinking, it's gonna be 2 community sessions in the community to just update on CEDAW. Just in my initial conversations at networking events, not a lot of people know what it is.
Well, I was just gonna ask, could you catch me up on what CDOT is?
Yes, Jason, you want to say it?
Okay. CDOT is the Convention to End All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's a UN charter that, it's something that goes back to the beginning of the UN charter. But it's part of the second phase of, anyway,
I know, it's Tuesday.
we worked on it for 10 years, basically. It got adopted in Salt Lake City as an ordinance. Well, it first got adopted as a resolution. The United States was not a signatory of it. It was 1979, I believe it was, when it got put before the full United Nations. So now municipalities and states have been adopting it. Salt Lake City adopted it as a resolution about 10 years ago. It started on the process 10 years ago. Adopted as a resolution about 6 years ago, and then the entire time I've been on the Human Rights Commission, we've been working on getting it adopted as an ordinance. We just got it adopted last few months ago. So
Could you send me that?
part of the ordinance,
Ordinance?
so part of the ordinance requires that there be certain things done on a regular basis. That involves the city to do a equity review every few years, every 5 years, or is it
Every 5 years, a gender equity analysis is what they call it.
So there's an gender equity analysis, and the body that oversees compliance is the Human Rights Commission. So basically, we have to have a standing committee that ramps up, cooperates with the city in their gender equity review, does the data analysis, and then presents it back to the city again every 5 years. So
When is that 5 years? What's the deadline?
Well, we have to get it started first, that's
Yes.
why this task force is important.
it's
Well, no, yeah, it sounds like it's critically important. It's our jurisdiction and we have to report to the council.
So it's brand new, and right now it's just ramping up, but it's because it just got adopted as an ordinance a few months ago.
Do we have authority and a budget to hire outside professionals to do any kind of survey work?
I don't believe we do. That would be a request that we would make through the mayor's office or through the city council. if we
Yeah, I
needed
mean,
to
I
hire
think
an
it's pretty hard to assess women's equity absent some surveys or some polling or at least gathering data.
So that's another side of it is this Human Rights Commission is working on trying to establish a gender equity tool that can be used in the city to assess compliance department by department, but that's also something that's been on the back burner for a little while. So anyway,
Yeah, I would say at a minimum, we need to enlist some expertise from the universities to see if they can help us come up with those tools to measure women's equity. I think it's very important, especially in Utah, where generally women are underpaid and undervalued. So I think it'd be really important for us to make a strong statement, but we can't just do it ad hoc.
Agreed, but the first step of getting it adopted into city code as an ordinance gives us the authority to now form this task force, I guess. We're referring to it as a subcommittee or a task force.
I think a task force now, because I just think, of course, you all have involvement with this, but I think having the task force, like I've already met with Kilo Zamora, who is a well-respected gender researcher and community member of Salt Lake City for many years, actually
Used to
started.
be a chair of the Human Rights
Yes, for the
Commission.
Human Rights Commission, and saw like the beginning of this, so in my meeting with Kilo, he gave me the history of CEDAW because he was there at the beginning, and when our DEI team wasn't a team back then, it was just the Office of Human Rights. He gave me key stakeholders to reach out to, because we're hoping that this task force will bring expertise. Like, we've already thought about the research part, and we're gonna work with the Kennedy Gardner Policy Institute, that's one of our plans, yeah. Right, like, we have to do it on our own, it's on the commission, but it really, the ordinance, I can send it out to everyone, so we
I
have
think
it.
it'd be helpful to review that ordinance. I haven't seen it myself.
Yes,
So
because
that-
it's very outlined, like it's basically the chief equity officer and myself. So we feel a lot of the work of it, but I have to give updates here, and I'm hoping that task force can help. As well as, I believe right now, we just have Esther, Jason, and Olivia on that subcommittee, so they'll be looped in as well, and then we'll give updates here. But
So essentially, once this
yes,
body gets established, is then when we start building the organization and structure and sort of seeing what we need, and then we start making the asks for things like, we need to hire a pollster, or we need to hire a statistician, or something like that. But for now, we just have to, we're kind of building the car while it's in motion.
yes.
So anyway, so anything else on CDOT?
That's pretty much it for right now.
Do we have anything on gentrification?
I have a little update. I've reached out to former Commissioner Garcia, she's chair of the gentrification committee, and we have a meeting, not next week, but then the week after that, and I'm just gonna kind of meet with her and have her, I'd like to kind of pick up where she left off and see what I can learn from her.
Thank you for
Awesome. It's a huge topic, so I don't think we can.
Yeah.
And it's my understanding that that former commissioner really was passionate
She,
So
yeah,
they
I
kind
could
of
tell,
have
I saw her
knowledge.
like bio page on
Yes.
like some university website, and she's,
about
yeah.
it. So we can get that intel so that we
For
can
sure.
build it up again. Yes, thank you. Lulu.
Yes.
So refugees and new Americans, we met virtually last month. Was it Pamela? Sorry, I can say. Yeah, Commissioner Silverman was not able to join us, and so her expertise was not available at the time. We kind of did some brainstorming on some directions that we can cooperate with the I'm blank now.
What are you thinking of?
IRC?
No.
Roxanne?
Roxanne, yeah.
Yes.
That,
The policy advisor for refugees and new Americans.
sorry, I completely drew a blank there. So anyway, we're talking about some way, brainstorm some ways that, because they are a office that is specifically devoted to that, about giving them some direction, some guidance, support, but there wasn't a whole lot of things that we could take lead on, it seemed. That was my impression, but there were notes were taken. We can share them with anybody if they wish to see what was discussed, but it was more kind of vision, brainstorming what direction, and come up with some ideas for Roxanne to start developing.
Did Commissioner Silverman end up agreeing to chair that committee or no?
She did not. She wants to participate, but I was not able to participate in that meeting, so I'm hoping that can get her involved and move forward from there, because it is a topic I am woefully ignorant of.
Yes, and just to add on to Commissioner Wessel's point, right now Roxana is working on developing a resource guide. So that is one tangible thing that the subcommittee will be a part of. But right now she is in discussion with our chief equity officer and how to go about that. Like what organizations get added onto it, and just the different nuances there.
That dates back to, that was the suggestion of former Commissioner Dumbia, wanted to have a resource guide that could be ready to hand to refugees and new Americans. It wouldn't just be like police, fire, paramedics, it would also be like grocery stores that cater to the African community, or community centers that cater towards a Polynesian community or something like that. It would be a comprehensive guide for somebody that could use to look up, I guess, businesses, public, private, everything that would be interesting to refugees and new Americans. So that was kind of the starting point, and I think that Roxana liked the idea enough that she's trying to take it and run with it.
I think it'd be a great resource for, refugees and new Americans coming into the city. They have something they can turn to. I would suggest that once it's finalized, it be published in multiple languages.
Is that something that we're gonna review before it's finalized?
Sorry?
Would that be
I
something?
presume we'll get a chance to look at it, sure.
Definitely. And I believe the The only pushback I've heard on that idea came from when Commissioner Dubia first brought it up, and it was that a lot of times chambers of commerce and very specific niche, business-oriented things have a system where they get businesses to buy access to being put on lists like that, and it might be stepping on some other entity's toes if the city were to have one that was for free. But I don't know. That's another subject I have no knowledge of. Is
I'd be in favor of doing it and seeing who screams the loudest, and then deal with the screamers first.
agreed. Some of the chambers have quite a bit of clout. Okay, so anyway, that's all I've got on refugees and new Americans. Did you have anything else?
I think that's pretty much it till we meet next week again.
Okay, and then children and youth advocacy. I have a conflict that usually on the same time that meeting happens, so I've missed both of the last two.
So I'll just take a few minutes. Michelle and Esther and I met, and we decided that the topic was so broad that we needed to narrow it. And right, wrong, or indifferent, we decided to narrow it down to preschool children and focus on what human rights needs in the community of children pre-K. In other words, how can we give those kids the best foot forward, the best start in the education system and in the social systems. That's what we decided would be our focus. Esther, chime in here if I get it wrong. And in order to figure out what the needs are of that population, we decided first to try and survey the organizations in the community that are currently serving children and young adults. And so on April 13th, and we also decided that we ought to start with the organizations in Salt Lake City that are supported by Salt Lake City government that are serving the population. So on April 13th, Michelle and I met with representatives of the Salt Lake City Youth and Family Services. We went over there, we had a really productive meeting with them, and in the interest of time, I prepared some notes of that meeting, and I would simply suggest that the notes be added to the minutes of this meeting. I circulated them to Esther and Michelle, didn't receive any comments back one way or the other, so I presume they're acceptable. They're my notes anyway, so they're just incorporated as part of the minutes of the meeting. And I do think that one thing positive that came out of that interaction was information about programs that Youth and Family Services have initiated in the community that we're invited to participate in. And I think Michelle has sent around some invitations, some calendar invites to some of those programs. Time permitting, and if our schedules permit, I think it would be a good idea if representatives of this commission could show up at some of those events to help support what Youth and Family Services are doing. One event that looks really interesting is this Young Heroes event, which is going to be it's the Youth Human Rights Awards. It fits perfectly with what we're doing.
Is that the one
That's
that's
on,
scheduled?
that's on May 5th,
On Friday.
coming right up, May 5th at the Sorensen Unity Center from 4 to 6 p.m. And the other one is on June 6th. As a tentative date, we've invited representatives of Youth and Family Services to come to this meeting and make a presentation to us about what they do. The most pressing need they have at the moment is our support for getting a $100,000 grant so that they can design, they want to hire a consultant to design a strategic plan to figure out the best way to coordinate their services with the services of other agencies that are also dealing with and addressing this population. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that if they make a presentation to us, but I think it's worthy of our attention that we may support them with the city council and help them get some funding from that. That's all I have right now. We have another meeting coming up, and hopefully we'll identify another agency that we can go visit with that hopefully will give us more input.
Commissioner Letter, thank you so much for that input, and I did see your notes. I haven't had a chance to review it yet, but I do trust that your participation in that meeting was very helpful, and the information that you've just provided is also very helpful. So thank you for that. As Commissioner Letter just mentioned, during one of our meetings, we decided to focus on the younger group because dealing with the entire youth would be a much bigger focus, and we want to be able to affect change, and we could do that when things are a bit narrow, and we could be a part of that process. So thank you, Michelle, for setting up the meeting with the youth and family group in the city. That was very enlightening, just to see what the city in general is doing before we jump into assume what's not being offered. So thank you for that.
Okay, that's all I have.
Yes, thank you. It sounds like you guys have been very productive.
Yes.
Okay, we are at our normal stopping time, correct? Yeah. So does anybody have something pressing they want to discuss or bring up human rights since last time we met?
Move adjourn.
Okay, there's a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, motion's been made and seconded. Let's see if there's any objections. So without objection, without objection, without objection. See no objections, the motion passes.
I like your style, Jason. Speak up for everyone, please.
It goes much faster.